as a way of getting you excited about our history club, next month we are going to have the history of the Old Faithful Inn by Jim McDonald. Perhaps you're aware of Jim McDonald. He spent a lifetime on historic preservation, and he had the contract to redo the Old Faithful Inn in Yellowstone National Park. I took a Mali class from him, and this was one of his programs, and he's going to compress it down from an hour and a half to an hour, but it's really fascinating how they were able to take the Old Faithful Inn and during the off-season refurbish it and still keep it functioning and strengthen it up. It's going to be a fascinating program. I've already seen it. That's why I asked him. So be sure you come March 25th. And we have others listed here on future months. So tonight's speaker is Bill Taylor. He's a retired high school teacher. He taught English and history for 27 years here in Missoula. He and his wife, Jan, have written 5 published histories of the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern Railways in Montana. He tells me he's a railroad man, and I believe it because it says he is the vice president of the Pacific Railway Historical Association, and they've owned a speeder, and I asked him to explain that to me. Maybe he'll do that before he gets into his talk. That's really fascinating. That traveled over 30,000 miles in 28 years. He also was associated with the Montana Daylight, which was a tour train that operated between, Sandpoint, Idaho, and Livingston, Montana, between 1996 and 2004. Jan and Bill both have been published in a variety of historical journals. This man knows of what he speaks. Thank you very much for being our speaker tonight, Bill.
You're welcome, Lee. Thank you. Do you really want me to explain a speeder? Yes. Please don't confuse it with the ones in Star Wars. The little things that went, over the top of the desert and Luke Skywalker rode in, and it wasn't one of those. In days gone by, the railroads had need to send maintenance away crews out to repair track and other things, and it was too expensive to send trains, so they sent little putt-putts that looked kind of like a Jeep or a lawn cart or whatever, with anywhere from 1 to 8 people in it, depending on what they had to do. In about 1992, they quit using those in favor of high rail gear on pickups, and they sold them off at auction. And I got wind of 2 that were being sold by Rail Link, and I bought both of them, sold one to the other guy. And that machine stayed with me for about 15 years, and I put over 30,000 miles on that thing. Not all at one time, not all at 1 year, but over the course of the 15 years. And then I had 2 others later on that had more amenities like heaters and seats and a closed cab and things like that. It was a lot of fun. We did it all legally. We belonged to an organization nationwide that had a $10 million liability policy to protect railroads in case of an accident, and we had to sign all kinds of waivers and stuff, but don't get me started on speeders.
Quick question, Bill. Where was yours made?
In Fairmont, Minnesota.
That's my hometown.
All right, you did a good job. You did a good job. As Lee indicated in my introduction, I am a retired school teacher, so I don't care who you are. I've had harder audiences than you, often. I taught mostly juniors and seniors, 5 years at Hellgate High School, and then when they built Big Sky, I went out to Big Sky High School and became department chair out there and supervised 14 other English teachers, which is sort of like trying to herd worms. And retired with 35 years of service, wasn't burned out, didn't hate kids, and here I am still a teacher. Once a teacher, always a teacher. So when Paula asked me last fall if I could come up with a program for February, I said, yeah, probably. You want another railroad program? Because I've done 4 of those to this group. And she said, well, whatever you want to do. Now that's license, isn't it? So I thought at the time, well, we haven't heard a lot about the 1908 flood recently. And it was such a big deal to Missoula and to the valley, partly because of what so much was going on up the Hellgate River in terms of railroad construction and so on. And I have all these postcards and I have all these pictures. Maybe they'd like to see pictures of 1908 Missoula and the 1908 flood and things up the river. And I trust that's why you're here tonight, and thank you very much for coming. Little geography lesson. This river out here is what river? Bitterroot. Downstream a bit. Well, yeah, it's the Clark Fork now, and it has been since World War II, when, whatever the reason, the powers that be decided to rename the rivers. But prior to that, this was the Missoula River, and it started at the confluence with the Blackfoot, and it went clear down to Paradise, where it flowed into the Flathead. Above that was the Hellgate River, from the confluence of the Blackfoot up to Garrison, where it flowed into they joined the Little Blackfoot, and then beyond that it was the Deer Lodge River, and beyond that it was Warm Springs Creek, and now it's all the Clark Fork, probably because Clark River is the name Captain Lewis gave it when he came through here in the Lewis and Clark expedition, although it never really bore that name until recently. So in 1908, it was a year not unlike what we're having this year. It was a year where there were record snowfalls in the mountains, particularly along the western slopes of the Continental Divide, which is where the Hellgate River starts. And that snow hung late. Unlike here this year, where it's all melted off, it hung until June without much significant melting at all. And then all of a sudden, as is often the case, one of those warm fronts swept in from the Pacific Ocean and put down about 3 inches of rain on top of all that snow with predictable results. It came roaring down the canyon. It washed out bridges. It washed out railroads. It washed out everything, washed out a good share of Missoula. And now hydrologists call it the 500-year flood. You know, you have 100-year floods and you have 10-year floods. And that was the 500-year flood. So we've got another 400 and some odd years to go before we get another one of those, thank heavens. So I am not a hydrologist. I am not a river scientist. I'm a railroad guy. And so you're going to see some railroad photographs also because that's what I collect. But in there are going to be views of the river because everything up from Missoula, that river and the transportation systems and the electrical wires and the highways all travel the former Hellgate Valley through the Hellgate, which we still refer to, and on up the river until you cross the divide either at Butte or Helena. So they're intertwined and you have to deal with them together. I sat down today and I counted how many right-of-ways, power line right-of-ways and things. How many right-of-ways are up the Hellgate River? And I came up with 14. Everything from Indian trails to fiber optic lines that have separate right-of-ways up through that canyon, not to exclude Interstate 90 or still railroad traffic, because this canyon, if you look at a geographic map of Montana, is really about the only one that provides easy access through the western mountains west of the Continental Divide, clear out to St. Regis and Paradise and the Pend Oreille River. And it's as important as the others were as trails to the buffalo and so on for the native folks. In modern times, it's even more important as a transportation corridor. So my leading picture here tells me I need to talk a little bit about photography too. I don't know how many of you are photo experts. You know, nowadays, if you need to take a picture, you haul out one of these, click, 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 and you send it to all your friends over the internet, and they send theirs to you. Teenagers can't live without them. I'm getting so I can't either. But that's a recent invention. Anything from when I was younger, and you folks were younger, most of you, was probably a Brownie camera that shot little 3x5 photographs in black and white, because color film didn't get developed until after the war, and it was expensive. And your parents told you, quit that. And that technology was developed about 1910. Prior to 1910, the cameras were big, boxy things on tripods that required everybody to remain really still because they didn't capture motion. The shutter speed was too slow, and they required a wagon full of developing materials to develop. And so photographs were something very unusual and difficult to find and could not be reproduced in print. The ability to take a photograph and convert it to something that can be published in a newspaper doesn't happen until much later. Their first efforts at that was to print stereopticon cards. You've probably all seen the ones with the two pictures on them. You needed to have a little headset that you looked at it, and it looked like it was kind of three-dimensional. Has everybody seen a stereopticon? And postcards. And postcards were churned out because they could print that on heavy paper, and then they usually gave them to artists to enhance them with color, sometimes ignoring what the subject of the photograph was all about. And we're going to see all of that in my program tonight. So, are you ready to begin our journey? Well, you might be ready. There we go. Let's look at Missoula at the time of the flood. This is a 1902 Sanborn map, and Sanborn was an insurance company who insured primarily businesses, commercial properties, and they published these annual maps. If you were insured, you didn't get a new map every year. What you got was a book that had maps in it, and you got little paste on things to show you the changes on it. They either covered up something or pasted up on it. The only complete one of those books I've ever seen is in the Great Falls History Center in Great Falls. They have an original Sanborn with all the paste-ups in it. But this is a 1902 version, aerial photo. We're looking at the Higgins Avenue Bridge, which was completed in 1892. It was a two-span steel through bridge in the middle, and then it had piling abutments on either end of it. And the only other bridge across the river in 1902 and in 1908 was the Northern Pacific Railroad Bridge that crossed the river down here where Safeway is, as it still does. And it was a wooden bridge. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. You talked to me about that, didn't you, Lee? All right. There's the Higgins Avenue Bridge. This is the Northern Pacific Bitterroot Branch Bridge. The Higgins Avenue Bridge was actually a steel bridge. It had been converted in the 1890s, and the Northern Pacific Bridge was a wooden structure. Missoula was basically the colored stuff. Don't believe all of those squares were built up. That was not the case, but there were lots that were plotted that somebody wanted to sell. Here's one of our famous colorized black and white postcards of the era. This is from the south side of the river looking at Mount Jumbo. And you can see there's not much south of the river. About the only thing over there in 1908 was the university and a little bit of development along South Higgins Avenue. Notice there's no trees on Mount Jumbo, which I always find kind of interesting. Jumbo, of course, marks the beginning of the Hellgate Canyon. Here's another view of the canyon. I would suspect the photographer here was on the bridge, on the Higgins Bridge, and is looking up there. It's about the same era. It's before the floods. Again, notice there's very little development south of the river. This, Sally, correct me on this, but I think this was traditional camping ground for the Salish when they went to the Buffalo, right?
Yeah, but was that part of Hughes Gardens or what on the south?
You know, tell you the truth, when I look at this, right there, that looks an awful lot like a cattle feedlot to me. And there is some fencing down here, Maybe that's garden spot, I don't know. But it's certainly not any kind of real estate.
Also, the Prescott House showed in the background, I think.
Yeah,
Right? So you
yeah,
can see
yeah,
where
yeah.
it is. Okay.
Here's another one. This is probably just before the flood. We have the Milwaukee grade, which was coming through, being built by Winston Brothers in 1908, and it's not washed out yet. And the Higgins Avenue Bridge is spanning there where the Milwaukee Depot is today, and it's not washed out yet. So this tells me this is probably the spring before June of 1908 or thereabouts. This will all be gone in another month. One of my favorite viewpoints, you got to go up to the M, and then you got to go up to the ridge line above the M, and then you got to walk out on a little rocky outcrop to where the big tree is. And the big tree is still there. It's dead. I think lightning hit it, 50 years ago, but it's still there, and you get this spectacular view out across East Missoula, the Hellgate, and on to Bonner. And this is taken pre-flood, and notice how much development is going on out there in East Missoula. Almost none. You see the railroad tracks down there on their original alignment into Missoula, which was a very curvy operation that avoided bridges and tunnels wherever possible, and came in through the Hellgate. That picture in the lead slide of the engine up to its hubs in water is taken right down there where that bald spot is. And I'll show you more about that in just a minute. Here's a variation of that. Might even be off of the same negative, but better rendered. And this is probably a little later. We now have a curve down there in that road where it comes around Marshall Grade. But still, this is 1912. It's the date it was mailed. And it purports to be of the Hellgate, but it had to be before the flood because there's no flood damage down there. And there's no Milwaukee Road on the south bank. And this is what it looked like when all that work was done and after the 1908 flood and the changes that were made and the railroad was put across Bandman Bridge. And I warned you about this railroad stuff. We're going to get a little of this, but I have to do that to show you the river pictures too. In 1888, the railroad decided that the two big wooden bridges that connected Bandman Flats with the rest of the world had reached their life expectancy and they were too cheap to replace them. So they rerouted the railroad around Marshall Grade on the Bonner Highway now. Was that Highway 12 now, isn't it? It used to be Highway 10 that went down through Marshall Grade. You can still see the railroad grade there where the train is operating. That's an eastbound train. And he's going to be on this track until about 1908 after the flood. Whoops, sorry. All right, I warned you about artists taking photographs and colorizing them. That isn't all they did. They sometimes put things in that didn't exist if they thought it would sell more postcards. And I think that's what's going on here. But what it does show is that the artist had some memory that the railroad once went across Bandman Flats. And so he's got it wrong. It's not that close to the river. It was farther to the south. But he's drawn in a train on a track along that south bank of the river, which never existed. And also on the Marshall Grade side, the north side of the river, is an eastbound train, probably also drawn in so that he gets more bang for his buck when he sells the card. Bonner would be just down there beyond the head engine at the next mountain down there. And this is all very peaceful. This is all pre-flood. This is the way it looked prior to the flood. I did an article for a historical journal on all of the realignments at Bandman Flats and all of the various right-of-ways down there. I have a new thing here, and it's kind of awkward, sorry. This would be the original grade that crossed the Blackfoot at Bonner. and came down along the north side of the river, crossed on a wooden bridge right about where you duck under the freeway to go out to the new state park out there where the dam used to be, and then made the big loop around what's now Deer Creek Road. Deer Creek Road is on that grade, and then made a quick cut back over across another wooden bridge and across the flats out at East Missoula and on into town. Then in 1888, the Northern Pacific moved their grade to the Marshall grade line, connected at both ends with the original main line, but they didn't need the two big wooden bridges. And then presently, Rail Link and BNSF are using the post-1908 grade, which is through the big cut out of Deer Creek where the shooting range is, and both they and the Milwaukee use that same right-of-way through there. I'll explain why that was later. In 1906, William Clark, one of the copper barons out of Butte, sold off his mining properties to Amalgamated Copper. Marcus Daly was already dead, and Clark decided to open enterprises here in Missoula, which included the Milltown Dam, which generated electricity, and a lumber plant, and also the Missoula streetcar system. And for a few years, he's quite a force here before he decided to go to Nevada. There's Western Lumber. Western Lumber doesn't get built until 1909 after the flood, but that's what it looked like when it did. ACM eventually bought this and just eradicated it in 28, and everything moved to the Bonner Mill. Here's the Bonner Mill. I want to know how the photographer got this picture. Where can you stand out there, Kim Brigham, and get this view of the Bonner Mill without some kind of an airplane or helicopter or hot air balloon? But there it is. This is sometime prior to 1910, looking down on the Bonner Mill. In those days, they were driving logs down the river. They used splash dams upriver to hold logs during the dry season. And then in the spring, when the flood hit, they'd bring those logs on down into the mill pond here and into the mill. And the dam down here was to keep the logs from going farther down the river. I know this is before 1910 because in 1911, the Milwaukee Road built a bridge across that river above Bonner as they moved up to McNamara Landing to service the big Blackfoot lumbering company up there. If we look at the original grade east up the Hellgate, it looks like this everywhere. It was built on the cheap. In 1883, in June, when the NP was striving to connect with the other party of builders at Gold Creek, they were avoiding expense. The railroad was almost bankrupt. Henry Villard was pouring his own private money into the completion of the railroad. They were hoping that by bringing rich German investors out, that they would be so intrigued by all the possibilities of the West that they would invest in the railroad and save them. So it was important to get the railroad done, but it was done on the cheap, and it shows it. The bad news is that when those German investors came out, they got off at every stop, wired their stock representatives and said, sell, sell, nobody's going to live in this godforsaken country. Or at least a lot of them did. The NP operated on a manned staff system to forward trains, and they had about every 6 to 8 miles a telegraph station. There was one at Tura, there was one at Bonita, there was another one at Hellgate, and on Unseweiter on up the line. And these grew into kind of important places pre-flood. This is Bonita. That's the original depot at Bonita. So I'm thinking this is about 1890. And of course, the cameras in those days didn't capture motion, so everybody's lined up, posed for this photograph and told to stand real still. And if somebody doesn't, they're usually a blurry face. So you have the depot on the right, you have a section house there on the right, the two-story building, and then you have a water tank. There was also a mail crane and that semaphore that could be turned to show red or green to permit trains to go or stop. In 1906, an eastbound passenger train approached Bonita looking for a signal. The signal was green and they went on through. Unfortunately, the operator in Bonita was asleep. And he had missed the telegram that came to him and said that there was a stock special leaving Garrison going westbound, and he needed to hold the passenger train at Bonita until it passed. He didn't, they didn't, the stock train didn't, and they all came together about halfway between Drummond and Missoula with predictable results. Killed 3 of the crew members on the 2 engines, and one guy had a miraculous escape. He was launched out of the tender on the eastbound engine, went through the air, landed in the coal load on the westbound engine, and he was a little worse for wear, but he lived to tell about it. The thing that usually happened was all the coal came forward and the crew got scashed up against that hot boiler and scalded to death. That is the only telegraph operator in the history of the NP that was arrested and jailed for dereliction of duty. He realized when he woke up that he had a problem, and he ran and hid in the hills for about 10 days. They sent posses out looking for him and finally found him up Rock Creek and hauled him back to Missoula, and he went on trial. But he didn't do that again. Here's a little, another picture of Bonita. It was a well-photographed place. There was a little community that developed around Bonita out there at the mouth of Kramer Creek. So there was probably half a dozen houses, and these folks are probably all local folks. A.B. Hammond built one of his first mills at Bonita. A little bit farther to the east, we have Beavertail Hill. Do we all know the story of Beavertail and King Beaver? Sally, there's a job for you. It involves a kingly beaver that lived across where the little hot springs are there near Nimrod, and why that is called Beavertail, and I'll leave that up to Sally. But this is an early stage on the stage road. You can still see this stage road when you go over there on the freeway. It's off to the left. It's all grown over, but it still exists. In 1907, the Milwaukee had decided to build west to compete with the NP and the GN. They had reached Butte in 1908. They had done development on what's now the Hiawatha Trail and the Bitterroots ahead of things, so it was ready, and their plan was to reach Missoula in 1909 and begin through operations to Missoula. There was a bit of a difficulty between them and the NP because the NP already had the grade through there, and they were investing millions of dollars in rebuilding that grade and double tracking that, and they weren't real excited about seeing a competitor come in and parallel them. But unfortunately, there had been a court case that went clear to the Supreme Court years ago that had decided that in narrow valleys and mountain defiles, one railroad couldn't show that it had a greater need than any other railroad, so you had to share. And so the NP and the Milwaukee combined their operations and hired Winston Brothers to build both grades at the same time on a 1/3, 2/3 relationship, because the NP was building 2 tracks, the Milwaukee was building 1. Now, I'm sorry to get off into railroad history, but that construction is going on bunkers, and I'll show you just a little bit what that looked like, as the flood hits in June of 1908. Not a fun thing. So, if we climb to the top of Beavertail Hill in the late fall of 1907 or early spring of 1908, you notice there's still snow on the mountains down there at Rock Creek, we would see this. They're building a big trench under Beavertail Hill. They're building a tunnel, 2 tunnels under Beavertail Hill. That's the NP on the right, it's the Milwaukee on the left, and you can see that they're still operating over the original main line, because that's the smoke from a locomotive, and that's Bonita over there that went out around Beavertail Hill instead of through it. I'll show you another picture of that in a minute. This is a picture I just got a little while ago from a friend of mine. It's also from Beavertail Hill, from the top, probably closer to the mountain than where the highway crosses over, looking east, upriver, towards Bearmouth. Did you recognize it at first? It is so different out there, and we'll show you why that happened. But you have the NP's original main line here that went down and around Beavertail Hill and back up to Bonita. And you've got the Milwaukee coming through. We think the battery died. Anyway, you've got some Milwaukee construction coming down here, but notice what the river does. This is the fascinating thing. The river comes down along the mountains on the north side of the valley, makes a big dogleg up into that elbow above Beavertail Hill, and then right back on itself and down around the end of Beavertail Hill. The Winston brothers hadn't worked on this very long when they said, that's silly to put all that trackage in. We can reroute the river and straighten this out. And they did so. They captured the river between the Milwaukee grade and the NP grade, where it is still today. And that seemed to work, except for 1908, when it blew out the banks and we went back to the original channel. I have a friend who is a retired bridge contractor, and he says the one thing I learned early, he says that flooding rivers will always return to their original channel, and he was absolutely right in this case. This is also off of Beavertail Hill, looking down on the Winston Brothers power plant. This power plant was generating steam and electricity to use the drills for the tunnels that were being built under Beavertail Hill. That's the original grade going around the mountain. That's about where the state park is today out there. In fact, you go through that grade, they've dug through it for the access road into the state park. And over here, you got quite a little village that's developed, probably all workers for the tunnel project. Another view of the east portal at Beavertail, the double track NP tunnel and the single track Milwaukee tunnel are being drilled at this point. And if we look at a modern Google Earth picture of this part of the canyon, what you see still today, 100 and some odd years later, is the original grade line following the original channel of the rivers all the way down the valley. And then you see where 1908 grade cuts through those two peninsulas and makes those big fills across there. And of course, Interstate 90's had a role to play in that also as it was being constructed. Highway 10 is across the river, went up over the hill the long way. All right, let's go to the flood. Enough of these railroad pictures. June the 2nd, 1908, a wall of water came down through the Hellgate that flooded a good share of Missoula. This is a picture of the flats about where the Holiday Inn is today. Am I right on that, Missoulians? Michael, is that about right? Yeah. You're looking south towards the south side of the river, and notice the water is clear up to here, and all those people down there looking at it. Human nature never changes. It took out the Higgins Avenue Bridge in short order. This is a bridge that had been built in 1892 to make it more permanent. Had two through truss bridges and then some piling where it went across the channel there between the island and Higgins, and then south on wooden piling across what would become the Milwaukee Yard on the south side of the river. There's another view of it, this time from the south side looking north, of what Higgins Avenue looked like in 1908. You've got the big Hammond Arcade on the left before it burned, and the first interstate bank, which was Hammond's Bank in those days, on the right, and the development on up the street. But Missoula only had one bridge. This was it, and it was gone. And if you lived south of the river, you were up the creek without a paddle, so to speak, because there was no other way across except, oops, come back to this one. I learned something in this program. I'll just take a little caveat here. The Van Buren Street Bridge was built in 1909. We all know the Van Buren Foot Street Bridge used the through trusses of the Higgins Avenue Bridge. They salvaged those and used them on the Higgins Avenue Bridge. I didn't know that. Did you guys know that? Yeah, it goes to show you. So the only way across the river was on the NP trestle, which still existed. It was a little the worse for wear. But as you can see, people are using it to reach their homes and businesses on the south side of the river. And they would need to do this for a couple of weeks until the NP finally got that rebuilt. And they rebuilt it again later to put the big steel bridge across, which is still there today. Here's another picture looking south of the same bridge. And I'm thinking that they're busy spinning cables there to do some repair work on that bridge by this time. So it's probably a little later. All right, pre-flood or post-flood? I had to look at this one a long time to try to figure that out. I think it's pre-flood because the Milwaukee Road grade is still there. It looks undamaged. The water's high, so I think the flood has started. And we got people down there for their Sunday afternoon picnic to watch the high water. Boy, are they going to get a shock in a little while. All creeks that flowed into the Hellgate River also flooded. And this is Rattlesnake Creek. The Greeno Mansion would be just on the other side behind the locomotive here. And that flooded and floated. This is a picture that McKay took of them rebuilding the Rattlesnake Railroad Bridge as the railroad tried to get underway again. There was no segment of the NP longer than a mile that wasn't washed out. So all up and down the line, you had people who were stranded, who were railroad employees and others who lived there, who couldn't get out of wherever it is they were until somebody came along and made a way across the river. This is the Milltown Dam during the flood. As you can see, the water is rampaging pretty good. There was some concerns they were going to have to dynamite the dam, especially if the logs came down from the Blackfoot. They didn't, but it so damaged the Milwaukee grade went around that cliff face where the tunnel is now, that the Milwaukee abandoned its around the cliff face grade and drilled tunnel number 16.5. Milwaukee had numbered all their tunnels from Wisconsin. Tunnel number 1 was in Wisconsin. Tunnel number 2 is in Montana. Shows you what's going on in North Dakota. And this is tunnel number 16, which hadn't been planned. And the other tunnels had all been given their numbers, so it got a half. This is what it looked like when they rebuilt. Notice that concrete retaining wall below the dam is all washed out here after the flood. And notice how far the cliff face has retreated. And it's even worse than that now. I think you're going to hear at the presentation made by the Mike Costita and others in 2 weeks that that tunnel now has been condemned because it has a big crack, and they're afraid it's going to end up in the river. This is the Black Bridge in Bonner with the floodwater over the top of it. Kim, had you seen that picture before? And this is the log pond, sort of, upriver. The flash dams, remember, held the logs through the dry season, and then they'd bring them down in high water in the spring. Well, there was high water in the spring, and they all came down, and they all came down together with predictable results. You notice there's little bits of railroad track over here and a wagon wheel, brought a lot of their stuff down with it. All right, let's go back to Beavertail, that same view looking west. I apologize for the quality of the photo. These came out of the Elsacker family collection who lived out there, and they were primitive cameras in questionable light, but they did get images. You'll notice that we've got water coming through the tunnels here, and they've built cofferdams to divert it down to try to get it off the grade. And then back into the river channel. It's working on the original grade over there. The newspaper reported that there was 7 feet of water going through the NP tunnel at Beavertail Hill during the height of the flood. And another story had a young man in a rowboat who, on a bet, who took his rowboat through the tunnel. Might have been the only way to get to town. If we turn around from the road that goes down to the state park on the east side of Beavertail Hill, and we looked upstream, we'd see what the 2 railroads, or Winston Brothers, did to capture that river between the grades. And this is flood. I don't think this is the height of the flood because these grades are going to be washed out soon, and the river will return to its original channel. But they took out over 3,000 feet of track in a mile and a half when they realigned this river. That's looking down on the Winston Brothers power plant and what the river has done at the height of the flood. Here's the Milwaukee track going there. It looks like it's a little higher water. This is the NP track, which is underwater, and the river has blown through up here and has returned back down to that big elbow and is flowing out towards the state park. This is major problems for Winston Brothers. The NP tunnel ended up collapsing and had to be rebored, and they had to divert rail traffic through the Milwaukee tunnel until that project was done, which delayed the Milwaukee's construction west of here for about 6 months. There were 3 sets of those double tunnels that were built to straighten out the main line east of Rock Creek. This is Nimrod, out where the hot springs are. Again, you have a double tunnel for the NP, a single tunnel for the Milwaukee, and I'm thinking this has got to be pre-flood. I don't see any flood damage there, and I think there would have had to have been. It's not dated. All right, this is a station nobody's ever heard of. This is Hellgate Station. It's another one of those telegraph stations that's located up there east of Bearmouth on an elbow of the river. And there was a sawmill there and another power plant to do all that earthwork that we saw in the Google Earth image. And so all those guys are there with equipment, and they're trying very hard to save their grade in the big fill with no results. It gets all washed out. And Jan and I walked out there years ago, and that cut-off river channel still has railroad iron in it, left over from the big flood. Hellgate and Bonita were both cut off in the rebuild and pretty much died on the vine after that. All right, people stranded, get desperate, got to get to town. Not the recommended way to do it. This bridge was salvaged and exists down on the Bitterroot line. Those bridges, the steel bridges, were moved down to the Bitterroot. But that's, you see the cliff there in the background. We all recognize that cliff, right, from driving Interstate 90. And so you know where it's at, and that big flat down there, and it just flooded the valley. So just to end up here, one more shot from Beavertail looking east. The big picture is 1962. It's the last Milwaukee passenger train headed west. And that upper shot that's an insert up there is that one we looked at from 1907. Looks pretty much like this still today. Only we don't have any Milwaukee anymore. This engine here, I want to call your attention to, it's probably right out at the base of Mount Jumbo, where the track was going right against the cliffs there. You can see there's nobody in the cab. You can see the cliffs behind it. Look at the crew standing up on top of the caboose. And there's guys in the window. I would say their engine has stalled out in the flood, and they're seeking safety up on the caboose.
If anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand and I will bring you a microphone. Great.
How long did it take them to rebuild the Higgins Bridge?
Not too long. I'm not an expert on that. I can't say. Bill, do you know how long it took? It was weeks, because it was iron, and that iron had to be fabricated somewhere and hauled into Missoula and erected. So it was a while. I've seen a picture of a cable bridge across, with people going across on a walkway like a suspension bridge. So that was probably what they used in the interim.
Did a lot of people lose their homes, or was there a lot of residents on what would be the north side of the river?
I haven't
got wiped out?
I haven't seen a statistic on that, but I know that happened, because I know Patty Creek flooded, or excuse me, Rattlesnake Creek flooded also, and there was a lot of damage out there in East Missoula.
Okay, Bill.
Bill?
I think there was an area down there that I've seen or heard called Parker's Island, which was part of the original town site subdivision. And there was, at one time, there was a channel that was a slough that went through what would be about the parking lot for the Holiday Inn Parkside now. And then that island was real low, and there was a lot of houses down in there that, and they were real low end at that area. And they got washed out completely, I believe.
And I don't think that was an affluent neighborhood down there, and I suspect those houses were very lightly built and didn't stand up to floodwater very well.
There were some islands just on the south side of where the Wilma is. Did all those just get wiped out?
Yeah,
Totally?
Pretty much. You see post-flood pictures of the river, and there are bare sandbars and gravel bars out there where all the vegetation is gone.
Because the Chinese community had an island down in there too. Did they get wiped out as well?
Yes.
Because we had that lecture a while ago. Anyone else?
I was actually going to add, I did that Chinese history lecture, and there were more little islands in the Clark Fork than there are there now, and several of them had little homes built on them, like the Chinese one you mentioned, that were all flooded out.
And we've all grown up with the Clark Fork well contained between two big levees that were put in by the Corps of Engineers back in the 60s. Before that, I think it was prone to flooding in a number of places because there was nothing to retain the water.
I'm going to assume, because there's no photos of the university, that water didn't make it anywhere near the university, because there was I know there was stables there way back in the day, but I don't know if they were there then.
I've never heard of anything at the university being bothered by the flood, so I don't have any knowledge of that. Sorry.
And then what about, was any part of the whole, when you look at the aerials of Kelly Island, were a lot of those channels created when that flood happened, or was that kind of always a...
It was fun for me to look at the pre-flood pictures of the river in Missoula and the post-flood pictures, because the river is in different channels in a number of places. So my answer to that is I don't have specific knowledge, but I would be very surprised if those channels, some of them weren't created during the big flood of 1908.
That's what I was thinking. There's so many little side channels that probably was the aftermath of that.
I think it was always a threaded channel down through there, but I think those threads probably moved.
And then final question, do we know how far at any point with a modern landmark that the water made it on the south side of the river? I know there's no structures to base it against at that time, but
Well, all of that Milwaukee grade, which is now the Missoula River Trail down the south side of the river, was gone. Anything that the Milwaukee had built there was washed away by the flood clear up to the bank. There's quite a bank there behind the old depot where the ground raises up. So it made it up to that, and everything lower than that pretty much got washed away.
In his response to the area on the south side of the river, if you look at the terrain, there is a low bank that's, 10 foot above existing water right now, and then there's a high bank that's 20 feet above. That follows along on the north side of the old Missoulian, just to the south of the Milwaukee Depot, follows all the way down through by Russell at Third, that same high bank. Nothing went beyond that. And I don't know how deep it got in through that area. You know, as an engineer, there's a misnomer about when Bill mentioned earlier that, we got 450 years until the next one. No, it's the probability that a flood of that magnitude will handle this year. So you have a 1 in 500 chance that it'll happen this year. You have a 1 in 500 chance it'll happen next year.
And Missoula had big floods before. Don't forget Glacial Lake Missoula, and it created this valley. And those banks that Bill's pointing out to us.
Bill, was the landfill at the intersection of the river and Orange Street in active use then?
There was no Orange Street in 1908, and there was no landfill down there. Anything I've seen down there were farms and small garden plots.
The landfill hadn't started yet then?
I don't think so. I've not seen any evidence that it has. Bill, am I wrong?
Oh, okay.
That's all right.
I'm a truther.
That's all right.
The area from about Karis Park all the way down to the old Fox Theater, the hospital thing in there, the clinic that used to be there. That whole area was a secondary channel that would flood in high water, and in those days you didn't. The houses that were built on the south side of what became Front Street threw their garbage over the bank, and then after the town started to build, they drove their wagons down there and dumped them in the same area. I've watched construction over the last 40, 50 years from Karis Park all the way down that way, and I've seen them deal with that excavating or driving piles through that material.
And there's a channel of the river that came down right next to the Wilma Theater building in what's now Karis Park. I came to Missoula in 1964 as a freshman at the university, and in 66 I ran out of money and I went begging for a job. And John R. Daly's, which was located on Front Street right next to the Stockman Bar in those days, hired me as a cleanup boy. Great job. And one of my jobs was to take all of the guts and offal out of that butcher shop and put it in barrels and take it down the stairs onto what's now Karis Park, where we had an old Ford cab-over truck, and go out to the rendering plant out there where the plant is now. At that time, there were broken bottles and glass and tin cans sticking up through all of that fill dirt that they dumped in there in that old channel. I'm not sure it was a dump, but it was being used as a dump in a lot of cases. And I know the city was dumping all their plowed snow with the salt and stuff in it into the river off that bank as well. So my first experience with Karis Park is different than you would have these days.
Just for your information, Bill is going to do a program for us in May on the developments around Missoula. So if you want more of this, Bill's going to bring it to you in May.
Oh, good, I get even. Any other questions?
One here. about the two other bridges that are in Missoula here, when they were built, the Orange Street Bridge and the one over here by the university, the Madison Street Bridge. When were those built, do you know?
Well, they were all been rebuilt a number of times in their history. The last time the Orange Street was rebuilt, which was, 10 years ago, and improved, it still had a brass plaque on the end of it that said Missoula River,
Really?
dating back to pre-war. So I don't think it had been built in a while, and it was just a two-lane bridge in those days. Russell's been rebuilt, Reserve has been built, so they've all come much later than the Higgins Avenue Bridge.
Okay, thank you.
And the Van Buren Bridge was built out of bits and pieces, I found out.
Let's go back up the river. Can you be more precise about where that Hellgate station was in relation to Drummond and Bearmouth?
It's at milepost 148 on the Interstate 90. Excuse me? No, Drummond must be about 160. Yeah, somewhere in there. When you go east on Interstate 90 and you go through the Bearmouth Canyon, make those big sweeping curves, you go across a flat, around a corner, across another big flat, and then you go up a pair of hills to go over the river. Before you go up that hill, look to your right, and you'll see that view that I showed you on the Google Earth view. That was Hellgate Station.
Bill, my company renovated the old J.R. Daly meatpacking plant, and some of the old-timers in town said the best fishing in Missoula was just below that meatpacking plant.
Well, in my time, we didn't dump anything in the river, but who knows what happened. They'd been there for 100 years, so they probably did originally. I had an adventure in the ice cooler there one night. I was told never to go in there by myself because they were old wooden doors and they had a tendency to leak and they'd frost over and you could go in there and they'd be frozen behind you. Well, I'm 18 years old and invincible. I had to put some meat away, so in I go. And that door goes clink behind me, and I thought, ooh, I shouldn't have done that. And I went back, and it was frozen. I couldn't get it open. So I thought about that for about a minute. It was about 10 below zero in that freezer. And I loaded up every box of meat I could find on a dolly that was in there, and I hit that door at about 15 miles an hour. And they had to replace the door after that. So I was kind of in trouble, but I was alive. They were a forgiving bunch, I'll give them that. Any other